Hey guys, welcome back to Reserved Investments on YouTube. So today we're going to talk about sports card collecting and the market at large. What's propelling the market, what's happening in the market, how I analyze the market for vintage and modern sports card collectibles. Now, full disclosure, before I go any further, I know I'm going to get asked. I myself am not a fan of sports cards. Reason being is, if I invest in a market in the antiques and collectibles trade, I like to have a passion towards that market or that collecting category. I enjoy playing sports, but I do not like going to sporting events. I do not like watching sports on television. I don't even watch the Super Bowl anymore. Pretty much the day after the Super Bowl, I Google best Super Bowl commercials, and I also just get an analysis as to what happened during the game, just so that I'm not completely clueless. So if somebody comes up to me and says, "Hey Sean, who won the Super Bowl last night?" I can at least intelligently answer the question. But other than that, that's as far as I go. I'm not into any of these markets, but I do have clients in the antiques and collectibles trade who are, so I have to stay abreast of them. So I am very knowledgeable in this side of the trade. Now, to be fair, before we even start this video, we have to establish a difference between two terms that I already brought up, vintage and modern. There's a lot of misconfusion in the trade as to what defines something as vintage and modern in sports card collecting. So I'm going to give you my answer, and you may very well disagree with my answer, and I understand that, and that's okay, because one thing I can tell you, there's about 3 different terms or date ranges that qualify for vintage and or modern in sports card collecting alone, and no one expert can claim to have the lock on their definition of what qualifies as vintage or modern. So my definition of vintage sports cards is anything produced before the year 1980. My definition of anything modern is obviously anything produced after the year 1980. Now, some people in the trade will take issue with that, and they'll say, well, no, we need to split the market further. Ironically, if you look at how that worked so well for comic book collecting, you can log on to the CGC collecting forums right now, and 2 people are probably still having the same conversation where they're arguing over the time frame of the Bronze Age compared to the Copper Age, or when did the Copper Age begin and when did the Bronze Age end? Who cares, guys? Just accept it for what it is. That's what I say to sports card collectors. However, I want to be very pragmatic on this channel, and I do want to state that some people that I respect in the overall trade will state that vintage only goes to the year 1975, and anything past the year 1975 is modern. Other people break out modern into modern and neo-modern. I don't like to do that. I think it causes a mass confusion in the marketplace when people start referring to items as vintage, modern, neo-modern. Then what do you do in another 20 years? Do you call it something else? I mean, in my opinion, it's just ridiculous. So this is a very simple parameter that I have set up that helps myself. It helps a lot of my clients. Anything pre-1980 is vintage. If it's past 1980 in sports card collecting, it is modern. Not neo-modern, just modern. So a card produced in 1989 has as much clout as a card produced in 2019. They are both modern, in my opinion. Now, that is a moving benchmark, meaning at some point in this particular market, 20 years out, again, we're going to be in the year 2040. At some point, we're going to have to go back and visit these terminologies again, because at that point, maybe vintage will qualify as being upwards of any card produced until the year 1990. Maybe there will be a need to create a neo-modern category. I don't know. It's all how the market unfolds. As this market transitions from more speculative to more established, which right now, if we're looking at the vintage market for sports cards, it's very established. I would never ever say that that market is not established. Pre-1980 sports cards are pretty much established in the antiques and collectibles trade. We can't deny that. It's not a mature market, but it is definitely an established market that ranks right up there with vintage pre-1975 comic books, if I could use that as a comparison. So I just want to state that, because I do know some of you watching this who are really hard into sports card collecting. You probably may disagree with my assessment. That's okay. We can split hairs on that as long as the other basics are in order. So let's continue. One of the reasons that I put vintage sports cards as a cutoff at the year 1980 is because in the mid to late 1970s, there were a slew of what I consider key rookie cards. And if we move the benchmark to 1975, those rookie cards get pushed into the modern era of sports card collecting. I do not agree with that because a lot of those rookie cards, and I'm going to name some of them in a bit here, in the 1970s, they were not hoarded like they would have been if they were produced in the late 1980s. So that's key. And some of those rookie cards are for players, Bruce Sutter, Ozzie Smith, George Brett. Those players had rookie cards in the late 1970s. So it's very important for me to put the cutoff at 1980 for that very reason. Now, a lot of people are asking, Sean, what caused the massive acceleration of values in a lot of these cards, whether we're talking vintage or modern at this point in this discussion? Well, the reason is threefold, really. You had the rise of card grading, which a lot of people were not happy with when I did the video on CGC entering the trading card business. I kind of excluded the sports card category from that discussion. And I did that on purpose because I'm going to circle back around and I'm going to talk solely about sports card grading in another video all on its own. So I figured it would be best to bring CGC trading card grading into that discussion rather than use time when I was talking about my thoughts on that market where I only brought up Pokemon and Magic. So those of you that did watch that video, that's why I set it up that way, just so that you're aware. The other thing that brought out a rise in this particular sports card collecting market at present time was PWCC. PWCC, like them, hate them, love them. I have nothing but respect for them. Full disclosure, when I consigned my Magic the Gathering and Pokemon collection, part of that collection, in 2017 and 2018, I went with PWCC and they got me top dollar for those items. I was very happy with the items that I sold, the price point that I paid, and my return on investment. It was incredible. So I do like PWCC, full disclosure. But they have been a market leader in this realm, and it's bringing a lot of people out of the woodwork and into the fold. The other thing that is happening at present time, there is a rise of big pocket investors that are coming into this market, either on the vintage end or the modern era end. Now, you're always, when the big market investors come in, you're always going to have the speculators that follow. Because the speculators, they just want to copy what the big money investors are doing, thinking that they'll succeed just by copying other people who are operating in this segment of the trade. That has happened with comic books. It's happening with graded video games. It's even happening with Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, coins, currency, all these markets that are graded. Pretty much has their fair share of speculators and investors vying for a piece of the action. Now, in the 1980s, this is what a lot of people I don't think realize. The 1980s was an interesting time, not only for collectibles, but also for antiques. And I talked about this before on this channel. In the 1980s, you had Reaganomics, where Reagan came in, and again, I'm not going to get political in this. Don't worry, guys. You know where I stand on this. But Reagan came in, and he gave tax cuts to the upper 5% of the population, and he used something called trickle-down economics, which some segments of the population today, from what I understand, are still waiting for that trickle. Sorry, guys. Again, not a fan, but I'm just presenting the material the best that I can. And as a result, a lot of the people who had a lot of money started entering the antiques, the art market, the collectibles market. And rather than putting that money solely in the stock market, investing them solely in their businesses, paying people more in wages, they took that money and they bought paintings for $50 to $100 million. They bought collectibles. Traditional antiques were on the rise at this time. Antique furniture, graded coins were starting to become prominent in the 1980s. So this is really where the antiques and collectibles trade started to be seen as a viable alternate asset class. I've done videos on this. You guys can go back and watch them. Just look for some of those words in the title of the video, and that'll be the videos where I talk about that. Now, what happened was a lot of Main Street, meaning average folks out there, saw what was happening with some of these paintings that started to go from 10, 20, 30, 40 million dollars on up. And all these other asset classes, whether it was antiques, high-end collectibles, even luxury items were selling at a pretty quick pace in the 1980s. And they said, you know what? That's what we need. We need to be able to invest in something like that, like the rich are doing, where it's an item that you're going to buy at a certain amount and it's going to go up in value due to rarity and or demand. Now, do you want to know what this caused, guys? Mass-produced scarcity. This is where mass-produced scarcity came into the fold in the antiques and collectibles trade. So you had companies going, you know what? Let's overproduce some of these items, hold back the supply, and tell Main Street out there that we're going to make these limited edition collectibles that they could purchase, and one day they'll be worth money. So you had all these companies coming out of the woodwork, like Franklin Mint, the Bradford Exchange, and they would produce these limited collectibles that would be gobbled up through, what the hell were they called? Telecommercials or whatever. I can't think of the word right now. Commercials that would appear on television late at night, 3 o'clock in the morning, even 12 midnight, where people would go to the phone and they would dial, 1-800, I'll buy that for $5. And they would get connected to an operator and they would buy these collectible plates, collectible whatever, bronzed items, gold-plated items were all the rage. All these collectibles that were marketed as investments through some of these shrewd companies that came up out of Wall Street's fascination with higher-end antiques and collectibles. Well, the sports card industry was not immune. A lot of players wanted in because they started to see that a lot of the average people out there on Main Street would collect baseball cards, comic books, toys, and the like. So they said, well, what if we apply those same concepts to these markets? And all of a sudden, in the 1980s, you had Flair, Donruss, Score, Upper Deck, and even some other companies enter the market and start producing their own sports cards. Well, Topps needed to compete with all of these companies to stay viable. So Topps started to enter the market, and they also entered the market for mass-produced scarcity. Now, this is where it gets scary, guys, because a lot of you guys that don't know how to identify a speculative bubble, a lot of you guys seem to think, and I'm basing this on some of the comments that I got, that, well, gee, it's been a year, it's been 2 years, the market didn't burst yet, market didn't stabilize, everything's good. I can buy this stuff because the market's still going strong. This is the price that is paid. This is the price it will always be worth, if not more. That's price memory. Gets collectors into trouble all the time. Well, ironically, what happened was, for the first several years, this worked great. A lot of these manufacturers were making a killing. All they did was they pretty much used gimmicks, or they overproduced items, but they released them slowly to their distributors. So it kind of looked at the other end, or the other side of the equation, that, hey, these items are just trickling in. Obviously, they didn't overproduce them. We can invest in these items for the long term. This is something that's going to always have value. So what happened? Dumb money followed dumb money, and the greater fool theory was proven. People thought that they could pay whatever price was feasible for these items, and there would always be a greater fool that would buy them for a higher price. Well, that lasted for about 5 to 10 years, and then the bubble burst. Now, ironically, baseball cards were not the only market that went through this. Comic books in the 1990s did as well. This is also the same concept that gave rise to Beanie Babies, believe it or not. Even Pez dispensers went through their own speculative bubble in the 1990s, the early 1990s, guys. So all these markets at one point were not immune from this. Well, as it applies to sports cards, the question that I routinely get asked is, Sean, number one, is that going to happen again? And number two, is there anything worth investing in during that time frame? If you don't believe me, you can look up something called the junk wax era. The junk wax era is debatable, but the dates for it are pretty much 1986 to 1993. That's pretty much the terminology that I use when I talk to clients in the consulting side of the trade, where any baseball cards made during that time, sports cards in general, but mainly baseball cards, really need to be scrutinized, because that was the period when a lot of these manufacturers were overproducing these items. Now, anybody with a keen eye should be able to tell 1986 to 1993 is 7 years. So speculative bubbles, in certain cases, can last more than years. In some cases, they can go on for decades, guys. There's no rhyme and reason to some of this stuff, how it plays out. But one thing you must understand when you analyze the market for especially 1980s baseball cards and sports cards, if you're going after rookie cards from Mark McGwire, Barry Bonds, Wade Boggs, Ken Griffey Jr., all those cards are coveted today, even though they were made during the wonderful junk wax era. Well, ironically, if you have them in high grade, meaning they're graded by a third party, a trusted third party, and they're in a top tier condition, they do still sell for a premium on the market today. So there are always some items that come out of a speculative bubble that will have value on the secondary market, even after that bubble dissipates or even after the prices start to stabilize. I've said this before with Beanie Babies. Top 1 to 3% of the market for Beanie Babies. It's not like it was back in the 1990s. But there's certain Beanie Babies that you can Google on eBay or you can research that sell for several hundred, $500 a piece, even to this day. Not all Beanie Babies are worthless. Please don't think that. That is incorrect if somebody's telling you that. Now, when we look at the market today, meaning current modern times, vintage sports cards, modern era sports cards, if we look at that market and we see what's happening, there's a lot of companies that are still engaged in mass-produced scarcity. I just read an article where somebody during the pandemic went into a baseball card shop. He bought one pack or one box of cards in present day, and he pulled a $30,000 to $40,000 1/1 autographed refractor card from that pack, and it got graded by BGS in 9.5 all quads. The autograph was a 10. It's selling close to $30,000 to $40,000 right now, which to me boggles my mind that an item produced in the year 2020 would be worth that much to someone. I consider that to be very speculative. I would never advise anybody to invest in an item like that long term. But overall, if you're the person that opened that pack and ended up with a $30,000 to $40,000 card, that's pretty substantial. Which brings me to my one concern out of how these markets are operating right now. In my opinion, that's a form of legalized gambling. If you can open up one box of sports cards and pull a $30,000 to $40,000 card, I consider that to be very manipulative on the fact that a lot of these manufacturers are using mass-produced scarcity to their advantage. Now, you can argue, well, Sean, the item truly is scarce. I mean, let's be honest, it's 1/1. You can't get much scarcer than that, and I agree with you. But I don't think an item like that has organic collectability over the long term, and that's my concern. So when I look at the modern era market today and what these companies were doing in the 1980s, I can tell you it's worse. The difference is they're not manipulating supply like they were back then when they would tell people this is going to be a great investment, buy it, and they kept the printing presses running. Today, they're more or less using a one type of scarce object that's 1/1, and they're putting it in the packs, and they're telling people, hey, it's out there. If you can find it, you can make a lot of money. So I don't know which is worse, which is better. I will state, if I was an investor in sports cards today, I would want to go after vintage key cards. Your Ty Cobbs, your Honus Wagner, if you can afford them, your Mickey Mantles, Babe Ruths, cards like that are true iconic players in that particular pastime. Now, another thing that I get asked, and again, this is going to come up in another video, so I don't want to get too far off topic in this. A lot of people ask me, well, Sean, you must understand, in the 1980s, even in the 1990s, other sports cards, like baseball cards, were not hoarded in mass or produced in large quantities. So you had basketball cards, football cards, to a lesser extent, hockey cards that were being printed and produced back then when all the rage was geared towards baseball cards. So you can argue a lot of these other sports cards, like I just said, basketball, hockey, football, they had a lower print run and were not hoarded as much as the sports cards. Is there opportunity there? And I caution people because that market's on fire. Go look up what a Michael Jordan rookie card goes for right now, or a Kobe Bryant. It's an insane price. So I understand that those items were printed or produced in smaller quantities than their baseball card equivalents. But that doesn't mean that that market may be one of the best markets to invest in long term. Short term, there's a lot of people making money in that market right now. Same thing with the modern era marketplace for sports cards overall. However, I really think long term, the money is going to be in vintage sports cards, mainly baseball, of key players that really, really defined the game overall. Again, your Honus Wagner, your Ty Cobb, your Babe Ruth, and your Mickey Mantle. And that's the stuff I would tell people to go after for a long-term investment. If you want to speculate in some of this other stuff, I'm not saying you're going to do bad. You may buy a PSA 9, PSA 10, Michael Jordan rookie card for X number of dollars. If the market remains hot, you may be able to sell it 2, 3, 4 years later for a significant amount. I'm not going to tell you to avoid that market. What I would tell you to do, just like I advise my clients, use caution. If you never watched my video entitled The Secret to Investing in Antiques and Collectibles, I talk about anchoring different market asset classes when we diversify in the antiques and collectibles trade. Let me briefly explain. Let's say that you're really passionate about sports cards. I would advise you to put 50% of your collecting dollars in high-end or whatever you can afford key vintage cards in sports cards, if that's what you want to gear towards. Then the other 50%, you can choose more speculative items that do have growth potential and or speculative market potential. This is the same strategy I tell people who come to me and say, hey, Sean, I only like Pokemon. I only love Pokemon. The only thing that I'm investing in Pokemon, show me how. Well, it's a little bit difficult depending on what your budget is, because you have to go after a lot of what I call the truly investment grade coins. Your Charizards, your holofoil cards from the coveted vintage era. And also, you also have to devote some of your money to some of the more modern era speculative stuff, because that stuff still has growth potential. Even if it would drop in price, overall, those items are meant for short-term growth, speculation. That's what we call it in the trade. So there's different strategies you need to employ depending on what your overall goal is. I hope that helps. There's going to be more on this in another video. So this was just a primer on my thoughts on the vintage versus modern era sports card market at present time. Again, this is just part one. Very simple video. Nothing mind-blowing in this video. I don't presume it was anyway for most people watching. There will be a follow-up video created several months from now on the same topic. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.